The ship appeared at dawn. That's how it always started. One moment, the fishing village of Clonmacnoise slept peacefully beside the Irish coast. The next, dragon-proud longships materialized from morning mist, like phantoms crossing from another world. The year was 834, and 17-year-old Deirdre was drawing water from the well when she heard the screaming begin. She ran. Everyone ran. But the Vikings had done this 1,000 times before. They knew exactly where people would flee, exactly how to cut off escape routes, exactly how to separate the valuable from the disposable with the cold efficiency of butchers sorting meat. Deirdre made it almost to the forest before strong hands caught her red hair. The warrior who grabbed her didn't speak her language, but he didn't need to. His eyes performed a calculation she didn't understand yet, but would learn to recognize in every slave market from Dublin to Damascus. He was appraising her youth, her unblemished skin, her figure, her teeth. He was determining her worth in silver and deciding her fate. In that moment, Deirdre's beauty, which had been her village's pride and her father's joy, became the curse that would define the rest of her short, terrible life. What happened to Deirdre was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of an industrial system of human trafficking that operated for 3 centuries across the medieval world. The Vikings didn't just raid for treasure and territory. They raided for human bodies, transforming women and children into the medieval world's most profitable commodity. And the prettier you were, the worse your fate became. This is the story your history books edited out. The story of an empire built on female suffering, of markets where human beings were sold like livestock, and of a slave trade so vast and brutal that it changed the genetic makeup of entire populations. If you think you know about Vikings, you're about to discover you knew only half the truth. Before we continue, if you're interested in uncovering the hidden and often disturbing realities of history that textbooks gloss over, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. This content isn't easy to hear, but these stories deserve to be told. Comment below with your thoughts or questions as we go through this journey together. The mathematics of Viking raiding were brutally simple. A successful raid on a monastery might yield gold and silver, worth perhaps 50 marks. A successful raid that captured 30 young women could generate 300 marks or more in slave markets. The human cargo was worth 6 times the treasure. This economic reality transformed Viking culture. By the 9th century, slave trading had become the primary profit center of Norse expansion. Raids weren't primarily about land or loot anymore. They were about harvesting human beings for an international market that stretched from Iceland to the Middle East. Ingrid of Bergen kept records. She was unusual among Viking traders, a woman who inherited her husband's slave trading business and expanded it ruthlessly. Her ledgers, preserved in fragmentary form, reveal the cold arithmetic of her profession. A healthy field worker, female, aged 30 to 40, 6 marks. A breeding-age woman with no special skills, 10 marks. A virgin girl between 14 and 16, 20 marks. A noblewoman, educated, skilled in needlework and reading, 35 marks. A woman of exceptional beauty, noble birth, and virgin status, 50 marks or more. The prices told their own story. The younger you were, the more you were worth. The prettier you were, the higher you'd sell. The more virginal and noble, the farther you'd travel from home. Beauty was not a blessing in this economy. It was a guarantee of prolonged suffering in the most exploitative corners of the slave trade. Every spring, Viking fleets departed from Norwegian fjords with empty cargo holds and clear intentions. They followed established routes along coastlines, where they knew the settlements, understood the defenses, and had mapped the most profitable targets. Monasteries were popular not just for their gold, but because they often housed educated women in associated communities. Noble estates were raided for their daughters. Villages were swept for young girls before they could hide. The raids followed predictable patterns. Warriors would strike at dawn when resistance was minimal. They'd kill fighting-age men immediately. There was no profit in rebellious male captives, and they consumed resources during transport. They'd execute the elderly and the very young children for the same reason. But women between ages 12 and 40 were gathered, sorted, and chained. What happened next determined everything. In a temporary camp near the ruins of what had been Deirdre's village, a Viking named Bjorn the Trader walked among the captives with the practiced eye of a merchant evaluating stock. He'd been doing this for 15 years. He knew the markets in Dublin, York, Hedeby, and Kiev. He understood what different buyers wanted and what they'd pay. He stopped before Deirdre. Her red hair was matted with dirt and tears, but the color was striking. Her face, even in terror, showed the bone structure that would appeal to Byzantine buyers. Her hands were soft. She hadn't spent years at manual labor. Her teeth were intact. She was perhaps 17, almost certainly virgin, possibly noble given her bearing. Bjorn marked her with a piece of charcoal on her shoulder. One line meant, "Hold for premium sale." She would not be sold in the first market. She would be transported to Dublin, then likely moved east along the river routes to the great slave markets, where Arab merchants, Byzantine traders, and wealthy Eastern buyers competed for the most beautiful women. Next to Deirdre knelt her mother, Siobhan. She was perhaps 40, with the worn hands of a lifetime working. Bjorn barely glanced at her before marking her with 3 lines. Immediate sale for labor. She'd be sold in the nearest market to the first farmer who needed workers. With luck, she'd last 10 years grinding grain. This was the first separation. Mother from daughter, sisters from brothers, families dissolved in minutes based on market calculations. The Vikings had learned that keeping families together was inefficient. Emotional bonds caused resistance, suicide attempts, and reduced compliance. Isolation was part of the breaking process. If you're still watching, leave a comment letting me know what you think so far. These stories are difficult, but they're important parts of our history that need to be understood and remembered. The ship that carried Deirdre to Dublin held 63 women in its hold. The journey took 8 days through rough seas. The conditions were designed for efficient transport, not survival. The Vikings calculated that losing 10 to 15% of cargo to disease, suicide, or violence during transport was acceptable given the profits on those who survived. Deirdre spent those 8 days in darkness, broken only by brief moments when warriors descended with water and stale bread. She learned quickly which visits to fear most. She learned which women to avoid speaking to because their minds had already broken. She learned to recognize the sounds of death, the silence that followed when another captive gave up. She survived. Survival itself was no blessing. Dublin in 847 was no longer an Irish city. It had become the Vikings' western capital of human misery, a vast marketplace where the primary commodity was people. The slave pens could hold 1,000 women at any time. During peak raiding season, merchants from across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East converged on Dublin to bid on human merchandise. Deirdre's preparation for sale began immediately. She was bathed, her hair washed and arranged. Her wounds were treated because visible damage lowered value. She was given better food for 3 days to improve her appearance. She was taught a dozen phrases in different languages. "Yes, master. I understand. I will obey." She was taught to stand with proper posture, to make eye contact when ordered, to display herself for inspection. Resistance during this training was met with punishment carefully calibrated to cause pain without leaving marks that might lower sale price. The Vikings had perfected the art of inflicting suffering that didn't show. On the 4th day, she was brought to the auction platform. The marketplace held perhaps 300 buyers that morning. They represented the full scope of the Viking trade network. Irish collaborators seeking workers for their expanding estates. Icelandic settlers who had submitted orders for specific types of women. Byzantine merchants with letters of credit from Constantinople. Arab traders from Al-Andalus carrying gold dinars. Each sought different qualities, each bid according to different markets. The auctioneer was multilingual and expert. He described Deirdre in Norse, Latin, Arabic, and Greek. He emphasized her youth, her virginity verified by inspection, her aristocratic bearing, her undamaged condition, her education. She could read, rare, and valuable. He invited inspection. Buyers approached, examined her teeth, her hair, her hands. They evaluated her as farmers evaluate horses. The bidding started at 20 marks. A Byzantine merchant raised it to 25. He was purchasing for a wealthy household in Constantinople that prized red-haired women from the West. An Arab trader countered with 30, representing a buyer in Cordoba who collected beautiful slaves as status symbols. The Icelander who had ordered a noble-born woman bid 35. The final price reached 52 marks of silver. The Arab trader had won. Deirdre would travel farther from home than she could imagine, through Scandinavia, down Russian rivers, across the Black Sea, through Constantinople, and eventually to Cordoba, where her red hair and pale skin would make her an exotic treasure in some merchant prince's collection. She would never see Ireland again. She would never learn what happened to her mother. She would never speak her native language to anyone who understood. She would be utterly, completely alone, preserved in that isolation like an insect in amber for whatever years her owner chose to keep her alive. But Deirdre's story was one among thousands. The scale of this trade defies comprehension. Conservative estimates suggest that between 800 and 1100 AD, Vikings captured and sold between 500,000 and 1 million people. The majority were women and children. The majority were taken from raids across Britain, Ireland, Francia, and the Slavic territories. The trade was so extensive that the word slave itself derives from Slav. So many Slavic people were enslaved that their ethnic name became synonymous with captivity. This wasn't random violence. It was systematic economic exploitation organized with corporate efficiency. The Vikings established permanent trading posts from Dublin to Kiev, specifically to facilitate the slave trade. They developed specialized ships designed to transport human cargo. They created quality control systems to inspect and grade captives. They established pricing structures that reflected detailed market knowledge. They built networks of local collaborators who helped identify and capture valuable targets. The trade routes tell the story of a vast criminal enterprise. Women captured in Ireland might be sold in Dublin, transported to Iceland for domestic work, or moved east through York to Scandinavian markets. From there, the most valuable might travel the eastern route down the Volga River, through Kiev and Novgorod to Constantinople and beyond. At each stop, there were markets. At each market, human beings were evaluated, priced, and sold like livestock. The Vikings created an intercontinental supply chain in human suffering. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel if you want to continue learning about the parts of history that most people never hear. Hit that like button if you appreciate this kind of deep historical investigation. And please share this video with anyone interested in understanding the full truth about medieval history. In the markets of Hedeby, on the border between Viking and Frankish territory, a woman named Astrid earned her living breaking new captives. She was herself a former slave who had earned freedom through decades of service. Now she worked for the merchants, transforming frightened captives into compliant merchandise. Her methods were psychological more than physical. New arrivals were isolated for days with no information, no light, minimal food and water. This broke the initial resistance. Then came the basic training. Responses to commands in multiple languages, proper postures for display, acceptance of inspection. Those who resisted faced calibrated punishments, never enough to cause permanent damage, always enough to encourage compliance. Astrid was good at her job. She could look at a new captive and predict within hours how long the breaking process would take. Peasant girls broken by poverty were easiest. They'd already learned submission. Noble women were hardest. They had lifetimes of autonomy to unlearn. Young girls adapted fastest, their personalities still malleable. Older women sometimes never fully broke, maintaining internal resistance even as their bodies complied. The entire process typically took 2 to 3 weeks. By the end, most women had learned the fundamental lesson. Resistance brought suffering. Compliance brought survival. Not happiness, not dignity, not hope, but survival. For many, that was enough. For others, suicide remained the only autonomy left. The slave codes that governed this trade reveal its sophistication. These weren't random criminal enterprises, but legally sanctioned commercial systems with detailed regulations. The Gragas laws of Iceland, for instance, specified that a female thrall was entirely her owner's property in ways that made Roman slavery look restrained. A thrall woman could be bought, sold, traded, or given as a gift. She could be used in any way her owner desired. Her children belonged to her owner automatically. She could not refuse any use of her body or her labor. She could not own property, testify in legal proceedings, or seek protection from abuse. She existed in a state of legal non-existence, physically present, but legally invisible. The only limitation was that owners couldn't kill their slaves capriciously, not from humanitarian concern, but because destroying valuable property was economically irrational. Even this protection was minimal. If an owner killed a slave in reasonable discipline, no crime had occurred. The definition of reasonable was interpreted generously. These weren't theoretical laws. They governed the lives of tens of thousands of women across the Norse world. They created hell on earth made legal, suffering made systematic, torture made routine. The question that haunts any study of this period is, how did this happen? How did societies develop such elaborate systems of human commodification? How did ordinary farmers and traders participate in industrial-scale human trafficking? The answers are uncomfortable. The Viking economy became dependent on slave labor in ways that made the system self-perpetuating. Farms needed workers. Households needed servants. The textile industry that made Norse society wealthy required hands to spin and weave. Expansion to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond required laborers to build farms in harsh climates. Free Norse citizens wouldn't do this work in sufficient numbers. The solution was forced labor on a massive scale. And once the system existed, it created its own justifications. Slaves were inferior beings, the logic went. They were war captives, rightfully claimed. They were property by both practice and law. The system was normal, natural, even necessary. The same justifications would appear centuries later in every slave society, from the American South to the Caribbean. The Vikings pioneered not just the logistics of large-scale slavery, but the psychological frameworks that allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil. Before we conclude, I want to ask you, what surprised you most about this history? What questions do you still have? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. These discussions help us all understand these difficult historical realities better. The Viking slave trade finally declined, not from moral awakening, but from changing economics and politics. The conversion to Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries made enslaving other Christians increasingly problematic, though it didn't eliminate the practice entirely. The consolidation of stronger kingdoms in Europe made raiding more difficult and dangerous. Alternative trade goods became more profitable as European markets developed. Most importantly, the rise of feudalism provided alternative labor systems that didn't require the massive overhead of slave trading. Serfs were nearly as exploitable as slaves, but required no capital investment in capture and transport. The economics shifted, and the great Viking slave trade gradually wound down. But its legacy persisted. The genetic evidence is still visible today in Iceland's population, where Irish and Scottish maternal lineages outnumber Norse maternal lineages. The women who were brought as slaves left their DNA in the population even as their stories were erased from history. The place names across Britain and Ireland mark where markets once operated. The legal codes that defined human beings as property influenced European law for centuries. The trauma of depopulation affected Ireland and Scotland for generations. The trade routes pioneered for moving human cargo later carried other goods as the medieval economy developed. And the stories, the thousands upon thousands of individual stories like Deirdre's, were systematically forgotten. Viking history became about brave explorers, skilled sailors, and fierce warriors. The victims became invisible, their suffering edited out of popular history, their names lost, their experiences reduced to occasional footnotes. That erasure is its own crime. A second death inflicted by historical amnesia. Deirdre of Clonmacnoise lived 18 more years after her sale in Dublin. She bore 3 children in Cordoba, all taken from her in infancy. She learned Arabic and forgot most of her Irish. She watched herself age in polished bronze mirrors, knowing her value declined with every year, wondering what would happen when her beauty fully faded and her owner no longer wanted to keep her. She died at 35 of an infection that would have been easily treated in the modern world. She was buried without name or marker in a yard behind her owner's estate, one body among many in an unmarked grave. No one recorded her death. No one mourned her. She simply ended as if she had never existed. But she did exist. She and 500,000 others like her. They lived, they suffered, they endured, they died. They were human beings with names and families and dreams, all destroyed by a system that treated them as merchandise. This is their memorial. This is their story, rescued from silence. This is the truth about Viking history that popular culture doesn't want to tell you. The truth that the pretty picture of brave warriors exploring new worlds was built on an ocean of female tears and blood. If you found this video valuable and disturbing in equal measure, please share it. These stories need to be told. These voices, silent for 1,000 years, deserve finally to be heard. Subscribe for more historical content that doesn't look away from uncomfortable truths. And remember, the past shapes the present. Understanding historical systems of exploitation helps us recognize and resist them when they appear in new forms. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for remembering those who were meant to be forgotten.